The patrol car rolled up slow, tires whispering against damp asphalt, and Marcus Reed felt the moment tighten around him like a held breath. Evening light bled off the courthouse windows, turning them into dark mirrors. He stood still on the sidewalk, pen paused above his notebook, listening to the radio chatter crackle from the cruiser behind him. A door slammed. Boots approached. "What are you doing here?" the officer asked. Marcus kept his eyes forward. He could smell rain and hot metal, could hear his own pulse steady itself. He'd learned how to sound calm without sounding afraid. "Observing," he said. "Writing." The officer circled him once, slow, appraising. "You look suspicious." The word hit harder than a shove. Suspicious meant explain yourself. Suspicious meant justify your presence, your body, your right to exist in public space. Marcus felt the familiar heat rise, then force it down. "Suspicious how?" he asked. The officer's laugh was short, humorless, like you don't belong. A couple across the street stopped watching. A bus hissed away. The city kept moving, practice at not seeing. Marcus closed his notebook halfway, not in surrender but in control. He knew the policies by heart. He knew the scripts officers were trained to use, and the ones they weren't. "Am I being detained?" he asked. The officer leaned closer, voice dropping. "You will be if you keep talking." Marcus met his eyes and said nothing. He didn't need to. The test had already started. Behind the officer's shoulder, the cruiser camera blinked red. The cruiser lights washed the sidewalk in red and blue, turning rain into a trembling curtain. Marcus Reed stood with his hands visible, notebook tucked under his arm, the courthouse steps behind him like a mute witness. He felt the familiar tightening in his chest. Not fear exactly, more weary readiness. "Evening," Officer Daniel Harlan said, stepping close. His hand hovered near his belt. "What are you doing out here?" Marcus kept his voice calm. "Observing. Taking notes." Harlan's eyes flicked to Marcus's jacket, his shoes, the notebook. "You look suspicious." The word landed heavy. Marcus swallowed. "Suspicious how?" "Don't get smart," Harlan said. "You fit a description." Marcus waited. The rain ticked against the cruiser hood. "Of what?" Harlan leaned in, breath sharp with coffee. "Of someone who doesn't belong." A couple across the street slowed, then kept walking. Marcus felt the old calculation begin. Tone, posture, silence. "Am I being detained?" Harlan smiled thinly. "You will be if you keep pushing." Marcus nodded once. "I'm going to continue writing." Harlan's hand snapped out, knocking the notebook to the wet concrete. Pages bloomed open. "I said stop." Something inside Marcus steadied. He crouched, picked up the notebook, wiped the cover on his sleeve. "Officer, please don't touch my property." "Property?" Harlan laughed. "You should be grateful I'm being patient." A second cruiser rolled up. Officer Kim Alvarez stepped out, eyes scanning. "What's going on?" "Guys casing the courthouse," Harlan said, refusing to cooperate. Marcus met Alvarez's gaze. "I'm observing public space. I've answered questions." Alvarez hesitated. "Sir, do you have ID?" Marcus reached slowly, every movement deliberate. "Yes." Harlan's radio crackled. He glanced down, then back up, irritation sharpening. "You people always think you know the law." Marcus handed over his ID. "I do." Harlan read the name, then paused. "Evaluator." The rain seemed to hush. Marcus said nothing. "Evaluator for who?" Harlan asked. "For you," Marcus said quietly. Alvarez's eyes widened. Harlan scoffed. "That's a joke." Marcus met his stare. Body-worn camera compliance review. Department of Justice Consent Oversight. Silence stretched. The courthouse clock chimed once. Harlan's jaw worked. "You should have said something." "I was waiting to see if I needed to," Marcus replied. The radio crackled again. A dispatcher's voice cut through. "Unit 12, supervisor en route." Harlan took a step back. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his face. Marcus felt no triumph, only the ache of knowing the test had already been failed. Harlan cleared his throat. "Look, let's reset. Weather's bad. No need for misunderstandings. Marcus glanced at the notebook again, the smeared ink. Misunderstandings happen when power isn't checked. Alvarez shifted. "Sergeant's coming," she said, not quite meeting Harlan's eyes. A patrol supervisor's SUV pulled up, tires hissing. Sergeant Linda Porter stepped out, rain beading on her cap. "Report." Harlan spoke fast. Man was acting suspicious, refused. Marcus interrupted softly. "I was called suspicious for standing on a public sidewalk. My notebook was knocked down. My detention was threatened." Porter looked between them. "So?" Marcus handed her his badge. She read it, then exhaled. "Okay." Harlan stiffened. "Sarge, he didn't identify." "I wasn't required to," Marcus said. "This is an observation." Porter nodded. "Camera footage." Alvarez tapped her chest. Harlan swallowed. "Mine too." Porter's gaze hardened. "Then we'll review." A gust rattled the courthouse doors. Marcus felt the tremor pass through him, the delayed shake. He tucked the notebook back under his arm. Porter addressed Harlan. "Stand down." Harlan's voice dropped. "You're taking his side." "I'm taking the facts," Porter said. "Go sit." Harlan moved away, shoulders tight. Alvarez lingered. "I'm sorry," she murmured. Marcus gave a small nod. "Thank you for saying that." Porter returned his badge. "We'll be in touch." As the cruisers pulled off, the lights faded, leaving the street lamp's pale circle. Marcus stood alone again, rain easing to a mist. He wrote one more line, "Hand steady now." Across the square, a security camera blinked red. He closed the notebook, listening to the city breathe, knowing the evaluation had only begun, and that tonight would echo through reports, hearings, and lives long after the pavement dried. The test was no longer theoretical. It was personal now, for everyone. The office smelled of recycled air and coffee that had gone cold. Marcus Reed slid into his chair, peeling off his damp jacket, the notebook still clutched in his hand like armor. The courthouse incident replayed in his mind, frame by frame, sound by sound, the officer's sneer, the slap of the notebook on wet concrete, the blink of the cruiser camera. He could almost hear Harlan's words echo, "You look suspicious." Marcus set the notebook on the desk and booted up his laptop. He opened a new report file, titling it DOJ Compliance Observation, Incident Number 2314. Every word had to count. Every detail mattered. The language needed to be precise, impartial, yet undeniably truthful. He began typing. At approximately 1845 hours, outside the 14th District Courthouse, Officer Daniel Harlan approached and verbally confronted me while I was engaged in public observation and note-taking as part of Department of Justice compliance duties. Marcus paused, eyes narrowing. Even as he wrote, he understood the stakes. This was more than paperwork. It was a record that could protect future observers or expose patterns of harassment that often went unchecked. He added the sequence of dialogue almost verbatim, italicizing certain words to highlight tone, hesitation, and condescension. He included the physical actions, the knock of the notebook, the gestures, the body language. Every microaggression, every escalation, meticulously logged. A ping on his email pulled him from the screen. It was Officer Kim Alvarez, the one who had quietly validated some of the incident on site. Her message read, "Marcus, attaching dashcam and bodycam footage from my unit. Please confirm receipt. K." Marcus downloaded the files, checking timestamps. His pulse ticked faster. This evidence was crucial. Harlan's denial would falter under the combined weight of recorded sound, video, and corroborating testimony. But Marcus also knew the bureaucracy he was up against. Complaints like his often got buried. Officers accused rarely face immediate scrutiny, and even when they did, administrative review often translated to months of paperwork with little consequence. He started drafting a chain of events diagram, linking each action to potential policy violations. He made notes in the margins about how the verbal escalation reflected a broader culture of bias, how casual assumptions about suspicious people often aligned with race rather than behavior. As he worked, his phone buzzed. It was a news alert. Local courthouse incident sparks public debate over racial profiling. He opened it, reading quickly. The article was thin, more speculative and factual, but it confirmed something Marcus already knew. Harlan's misjudgment wouldn't stay private for long. Marcus leaned back, rubbing his temple. The emotional weight pressed in. Every time he recalled Harlan's laughter, he felt the old frustration stir. The frustration of being judged before words were exchanged, of standing still and still being perceived as a threat. He typed again, this time focusing on his own measured response, emphasizing the restraint he'd maintained despite provocation. He included Officer Alvarez's intervention, noting her professionalism and courage. By the time the first draft of the report was complete, Marcus leaned back and exhaled. The rain outside had stopped, leaving a faint smell of wet asphalt. He saved the file, then double-checked all attachments, video files, timestamps, photos of the notebook in the officer's patrol car, and his own notes. He hesitated before clicking Submit. Once sent, the report would enter the DOJ compliance system, triggering an internal review. Harlan's actions, once casual and unchecked, would now be examined under a microscope. Marcus felt the familiar tension between hope and weariness. Justice was slow, and vindication never came without cost. A notification blinked, a red receipt from the DOJ's compliance portal. Marcus leaned forward. The words "report received, pending review" glowed softly. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the relief and dread mingle. Somewhere, Officer Harlan was probably recounting the story differently, shaping his narrative to avoid accountability. But Marcus knew. The cameras, the timestamps, the unyielding sequence of facts, they couldn't lie. And slowly, methodically, they would tell the story that needed to be told. He opened a fresh page in his notebook, jotting down the next steps, follow-ups, interviews, cross-referencing previous complaints. The work was far from over. But for the first time since the encounter, Marcus felt a small, steady spark of control. The evaluation had begun, and this time it would be thorough. The office lights flickered. Outside, the city carried on, unaware of the quiet reckoning being drafted in that small, cluttered room. And in that moment, Marcus Reed knew. The truth would speak louder than prejudice, even if it took months to be heard. The hum of fluorescent lights was deafening in the Internal Affairs office. Marcus Reed sat at the edge of a long table, laptop open, documents stacked neatly before him. Officer Harlan had been summoned, and the tension was thick enough to taste. Marcus's notebook lay open, a silent witness to every calculated movement. Sergeant Linda Porter, calm but authoritative, began the session. "We're here to review an incident outside the 14th District Courthouse on January 13th, she said. Her eyes shifted briefly to Harlan. "Officer Harlan, we've reviewed your preliminary statement. We also have body cam footage." Harlan shifted in his seat, jaw tight. "I did nothing wrong. I followed protocol." Marcus felt a familiar churn of frustration, but kept his hands still. He had learned to resist the urge to flare. His words needed weight, not heat. Alvarez, sitting quietly off to the side, cleared her throat. "So," she said, "the footage shows Mr. Reed was stationary on the public sidewalk, engaged in note-taking. There was no threatening behavior." Harlan scoffed. "You're interpreting behavior. That's subjective." Marcus spoke, measured but firm. "I was performing federal compliance observation duties. My presence posed no threat, and my responses were measured according to law and protocol." The room was silent for a moment. Then another officer, a junior detective, muttered under his breath, "He's making them nervous." Harlan's glare swept the room. "You people think you can just sit there and judge us?" His voice tightened. There was anger, but also the unease of a man aware he might be cornered. Porter raised a hand. "Officer Harlan, we're not judging. You are being evaluated. That's the process. Silence does not equal agreement, but it does equal professionalism." Marcus noticed Harlan's fingers tighten on the armrest. The body cam footage played again on the large monitor. The initial approach, the word suspicious, the notebook falling to wet concrete. Harlan flinched at a close-up of his own hand knocking Marcus's notebook down. "See this?" Marcus said, pointing. "Intentional contact with personal property. That's part of the review." Harlan leaned back, a flicker of disbelief crossing his face. "You're Analyzing me. Marcus kept his gaze steady. I'm evaluating adherence to policy, law, and professional conduct. That includes all officers, including you. A quiet murmur passed among the other officers in the room. Some avoided eye contact with Harlan, while a few looked at Marcus with mild respect. Silence spoke more than words. This was the unspoken tension of institutional power. Harlan's tone hardened. You're not supposed to. This is internal. My career. Porter interrupted. Careers are never exempt from oversight. Officer. Protocol exists to protect the public, the department, and officers themselves. Compliance is not optional. Marcus leaned slightly forward. The problem isn't just me. It's systemic. The way assumptions are made based on appearance, the casual escalation, the intimidation. My case is one instance among many. Harlan's shoulders stiffened. That's unfair. You don't know the full context. I know what the law allows, Marcus said softly, and what it protects. The room held its breath. Silence, Marcus realized, could be louder than accusation. The blue wall of silence, the unspoken alliance among officers, was being pierced delicately by evidence, by testimony, by the truth of observation. Alvarez handed Marcus a folder. Hey, complaints from previous months. Some involve your officer here. She avoided Harlan's gaze. Harlan's hand twitched. He glanced at the documents, reading lines that showed patterns he had ignored or dismissed. His jaw clenched. Porter addressed him firmly. Officer Harlan, consider this a formal review. Patterns of behavior matter. Your actions outside the courthouse are now part of the record. Obstruction, avoidance, or minimization will only strengthen the findings against you. Harlan looked at Marcus, eyes narrowing. You're the one gathering all this. You. Evaluating. Marcus corrected. Calm, precise. Not gathering evidence to harm you, but to uphold law and policy. A tick of frustration ran across Harlan's face, but he said nothing. Marcus could sense the internal shift, the certainty of power now meeting the certainty of accountability. Porter leaned back, glancing around the table. We'll continue with interviews, documentation, and further review. This is not personal. It is procedure. Compliance will take its course. Marcus exhaled softly, but the weight of the encounter remained. It wasn't a victory. It was a beginning. There would be pushback, resistance, and more subtle forms of intimidation. But the system, imperfect as it was, had begun to respond. Harlan remained silent, eyes fixed on the table. Marcus understood the moment for what it was, the first crack in a wall that had seemed impenetrable. He made a small note in his notebook. Observation. Officer's ego resists accountability. Corroboration strengthens case. Outside the office window, sunlight broke through clouds, spilling across the concrete. Inside, silence persisted. The tense, watching, uneasy silence of department confronting the slow awakening of its own accountability. Marcus closed his notebook for a moment, steadying himself for the work ahead. The review was only beginning, and the walls of blue silence would have to be chipped away one truth at a time. The morning news tone was clipped, urgent. Marcus Reed sat at the small kitchen table in his apartment, laptop open, coffee steaming beside him. The headline stared back. Local courthouse incident sparks debate over racial profiling by police. He clicked through the article, skimming the quotes. The reporter had called Officer Harlan's account conflicting and quoted anonymous sources about Marcus causing tension outside the courthouse. The story was thin on facts, heavy on speculation. Still, it carried the unmistakable hum of public attention. Marcus closed the laptop and leaned back. The buzz wasn't just about him. It was about what his experience represented. Every observer, every civilian, every black person quietly being assessed as suspicious in a society that claimed objectivity while practicing bias. By mid-afternoon, calls started coming in. Some were supportive, activists, colleagues in federal oversight, journalists seeking clarity. Others were hostile, veiled threats thinly disguised as concerned citizens questioning his motives. Marcus made notes, careful not to ignore the hostility but also not to let it overwhelm him. At the office, Sergeant Porter briefed him on developments. Media interest has surged, she said. We'll need copies of all documentation, footage, and witness statements. The public's attention makes this review even more visible. Marcus nodded. He understood the dual edge of publicity, protection through transparency, but exposure to backlash. Later, he sat with Officer Kim Alvarez to review footage once more. "You did the right thing," she said quietly. "Not everyone would have stayed calm." "I stayed calm because I had to," Marcus replied. "Control is the only leverage we have against abuse of power. Words, evidence, procedure, they matter more than confrontation." Alvarez hesitated. "Do you think it'll matter? I mean, really?" Marcus considered. "It has to. The first step is making the record. After that, patterns emerge. Accountability doesn't happen overnight, but ignoring it guarantees nothing changes." Meanwhile, Officer Harlan was already reacting to the public scrutiny. Rumors circulated in the department, whispers of overblown complaints, agenda-driven reporting, and media sensationalism. He called fellow officers, trying to shore up alliances, to remind them of loyalty, to persuade them that Marcus was exaggerating. But Marcus had learned that transparency could be a weapon of its own. Each bodycam clip, each detailed entry in his report, each corroborating witness became a shield. The narrative Harlan attempted to craft, one of suspicion and impropriety on the observer's part, could not withstand documented evidence. By evening, Marcus's inbox was filled with forwarded complaints against Harlan from months prior. Some were internal memos noting verbal harassment. Others were citizen complaints about unnecessary stops and escalated behavior. He began cross-referencing them, noting patterns, the same districts, the same phrases, the same defensive posturing. He realized the incident outside the courthouse was just one node in a much larger network of bias. Systemic behavior, once exposed, could be challenged, but exposure required patience and strategy. Marcus called his mentor, a retired federal compliance officer, to review the approach. "Don't underestimate the institution," his mentor warned. "People will circle the wagons. They'll deny, delay, and distract. Your job is to keep the record intact and let it speak for itself." "I know," Marcus said, "but it feels like they are trying to rewrite reality even as it's being recorded." "That's the point," the mentor replied. "And that's why your calm matters. Your credibility is your leverage. They can't argue with documented fact if you stay precise." The next morning, social media amplified the story. Short clips from the bodycam circulated, showing Harlan's approach, the notebook hitting wet pavement, Marcus standing still, composed. Opinions ignited. Commenters praised Marcus's restraint, criticized Harlan's conduct. Hashtag began trending, linking the incident to broader issues of policing and racial bias. Harlan's demeanor shifted from casual dismissal to defensive agitation. Emails piled up. His supervisor requested immediate clarification and an internal memo. Marcus anticipated the backlash, logging each communication meticulously. Yet, despite the growing spotlight, Marcus felt a personal toll. The repetition of the phrase, "You look suspicious," haunted him. Even in daylight, in his own apartment, he remembered the weight of Harlan's judgment. He wrote in his notebook, "Even when facts are on your side, trauma lingers." By late evening, Marcus reviewed the compiled evidence one more time. Bodycam clips, interviews, prior complaints, email exchanges. He added timestamps, verified footage integrity, and drafted a public-facing summary, careful, factual, devoid of sensationalism, but framed to withstand scrutiny. Outside, the city lights flickered against wet streets. He looked out his window, seeing reflections of cars passing, pedestrians moving obliviously. A single thought anchored him. Systemic change begins with records, with observation, with persistence. He closed his laptop, feeling both drained and resolute. Harlan's story was no longer private, and Marcus's quiet determination had begun to push against the walls of denial and silence. Tonight, the public was watching, and Marcus knew that when the system finally responded, it would respond to facts, not excuses, not fear, not prejudice. The morning air was heavy with tension as Marcus Reed walked into the DOJ office. He could feel the weight of the previous day's media tension still pressing against him, like a storm cloud waiting to break. Harlan's response had begun. Emails, internal complaints, and subtle attempts to discredit him. The pattern was familiar. Those in power rarely welcomed scrutiny, especially when bias had been exposed. Marcus's phone buzzed. A reporter wanted to comment on Harlan's side of the story. He ignored it, instead focusing on cross-referencing prior incidents in Harlan's file. Each note, each complaint, each subtle accusation was a thread. Together, they began forming a pattern. He sat with Sergeant Porter, reviewing the internal investigation timeline. "Is trying to shift focus," she said. "Casting doubt on your professionalism. Questioning your credentials. It's a classic counterweight tactic." Marcus nodded. "His weaponizing the system to avoid accountability. I need to anticipate it, document it, and respond through procedure, not emotion." Porter's eyes softened. "You've handled this remarkably well. Most would have let anger or frustration color their judgment. Your control gives this credibility." Across town, Harlan worked frantically. His morning began with calls to colleagues, pushing the narrative of being unfairly accused. He labeled Marcus overzealous and agenda-driven, painting the observer as a disruptor rather than the victim of harassment. Harlan drafted a defensive memo, attaching selective bodycam footage edited to omit Alvarez's corroboration, his tone formal but calculated. Back in his apartment, Marcus opened the new wave of emails Harlan had sent to the department. One subject line caught his eye. "Allegations against me are exaggerated and misleading." Marcus opened it carefully, taking notes. Every claim Harlan made was catalogued, every omission and distortion marked. He knew the system's vulnerabilities, the human biases that could tilt investigations if evidence was ambiguous. But he also knew its strength, precise documentation and corroboration. By mid-afternoon, Marcus received a call from Alvarez. "He's escalating," she said quietly. "I overheard him telling some officers that you're trying to ruin him. Some colleagues are uncomfortable." Marcus rubbed his temple. "It's not about him," he said. "It's about patterns, about accountability. But yes, escalation is expected when power feels threatened." Alvarez hesitated. "You need to protect yourself. Don't assume goodwill from the department." "I've learned not to," Marcus said. "I'm relying on procedure, not hope." They spent the next hour compiling every interaction since the courthouse incident. Marcus's meticulous notes aligned with camera footage, emails, and witness statements. Each element was cross-referenced, forming an airtight chain of accountability. Porter called mid-afternoon. "Marcus, Harlan's making personal attacks now. He's calling higher-ups, trying to frame this as a vendetta." "I expected as much," Marcus replied. "We'll let the facts speak. That's our counterweight." The rest of the day became a careful dance of strategy. Marcus drafted responses to internal inquiries, anticipating questions designed to unsettle him. He rehearsed testimony in his mind, emphasizing the narrative of evidence over emotion. He took a short break to breathe, stepping onto the balcony. The city sprawled below, indifferent yet full of movement, and Marcus felt the isolation that came with standing at the center of accountability. Late afternoon brought a minor victory. An internal email from the DOJ confirmed that Harlan's edits of the footage would be reviewed for tampering, and that all communication from officers related to the incident would be catalogued. Marcus exhaled, aware of the slow progress. The system was imperfect, but it moved. That evening, he met briefly with a local civil rights attorney who had been following the public coverage. "This isn't just about one officer," she said. "Your documentation shows a pattern that could influence policy, not just discipline." Marcus felt a mix of exhaustion and resolve. Patterns are the key. Individual misconduct is easier to dismiss, but systemic evidence demands action. At home, he opened his notebook again, pen poised. Harlan's counterattacks were predictable, expected, but they didn't change the truth of the footage, the logs, or the statements. Marcus wrote, "Counterweight, facts plus procedure plus persistence. Keep steady." Night fell, and the city lights glinted against wet streets. Marcus felt a subtle shift. Harlan's attempts to intimidate and deflect were being met not with anger, but with organized, methodical accountability. The observer had become the measure of integrity, the counterweight against institutional denial. As he closed his notebook, Marcus knew the next few days would be crucial. Harlan would push harder, allies and bystanders would react, and pressure would mount. But the momentum was now on his side, grounded in documented truth, discipline, and an unwavering commitment to fairness. The battle was far from over, but the scales had begun to tilt. Marcus Reed arrived at the DOJ compliance office with a sense of cautious purpose. He had spent days documenting the courthouse incident, Harlan's escalation, and the flurry of internal communications. Today, he was connecting the dots across multiple cases, seeking patterns that would reveal systemic issues rather than isolated misconduct. He spread the files across the conference table, past complaints against Harlan, officer statements, citizen reports, body cam footage timestamps, even internal training notes. The repetition was staggering. Certain phrases kept appearing. Suspicious behavior, non-compliant, uncooperative. Certain neighborhoods appeared repeatedly in the reports. Certain communities, particularly black residents, bore the brunt of these arbitrary judgments. Alvarez joined him quietly, carrying a folder corroborating evidence. "You were right," she said softly. "It's not just one incident. These patterns have been happening for years." Marcus nodded. Patterns are proof that it's systemic, not personal. Isolated complaints are easy to dismiss. Repetition across offices, neighborhoods, and time frames is harder to ignore. Together, they began mapping the incidents. Line connected neighborhoods, offices, and complaint types. The visual representation revealed clusters of biased policing, frequent verbal escalations, and improper stops. Each thread strengthened the case, showing a culture that tolerated microaggressions and, at times, outright intimidation. A knock on the door interrupted them. Sergeant Porter stepped in, her expression serious. "Marcus, I've reviewed your compiled evidence. It's compelling, but Harlan's allies are starting to push back. They are trying to shift blame onto you, suggesting bias against him rather than accountability." Marcus took a deep breath. "I expected as much. The key is to stay objective. Let the data speak." Porter nodded. "Exactly. Document every interaction, every attempt at deflection. We need airtight records if this escalates to formal disciplinary action." By mid-afternoon, Marcus received a package from the DOJ's archives, older complaints against Harlan that had been filed but never acted upon. Reading them, Marcus felt the weight of institutional failure. Each case had been minimized or dismissed, often with bureaucratic explanations that ignored human impact. Still, the thread connecting them all was unmistakable, a consistent pattern of bias and abuse of authority. He added the new files to his growing map. Lines multiplied, clusters intensified, the network of misconduct becoming impossible to ignore. Marcus felt a mix of vindication and frustration. Vindication, because the truth was evident. Frustration, because systemic failure allowed repeated harm before accountability began. Alvarez pointed to a particularly dense cluster. These incidents all involved minor, routine stops, yet escalation occurred every time. The language and tone are almost identical. Marcus leaned in. "Yes, Harlan's pattern of labeling people as suspicious escalates quickly to intimidation. Each incident alone might look defensible, but collectively, it's unmistakable." By late afternoon, Marcus drafted a summary for DOJ leadership. He highlighted systemic patterns, documented prior incidents, and emphasized the repeated failures to address misconduct. The report was both evidence and indictment. It would be difficult to dismiss and impossible to ignore. But Marcus also noted the human toll. Each complaint represented anxiety, fear, and humiliation for the people involved. He included personal reflections in his notes. Bias isn't abstract, it's lived. Each microaggression compounds. Patterns reveal not just policy failure, but community trauma. His phone buzzed. A news update flagged a social media thread discussing the courthouse incident. Citizens have begun sharing similar experiences, connecting Marcus's report to broader community concerns. Public awareness was growing alongside institutional documentation, reinforcing the pressure on Harlan and the department. Porter entered again. "Marcus, this is powerful work. If we maintain procedural rigor and present it clearly, we'll have a strong case not just against Harlan, but for policy reform." Marcus nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility. The patterns he was exposing weren't just about a single officer. They were a roadmap to systemic reform. But he also knew the human cost was real. For every Harlan held accountable, there would be emotional fallout, public scrutiny, and personal exhaustion. Evening settled over the city. Marcus leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. The map of incidents sprawled across the table like a constellation of misconduct, lined connected neighborhoods, offices, and incidents, forming constellations that no amount of bureaucratic silence could obscure. He picked up his notebook and wrote, "Patterns demand accountability. Not for revenge, but for justice. Systems can change if truth persists." The phone buzzed again, another email from Alvarez. She had collected further accounts from officers willing to speak anonymously. Marcus smiled faintly. Each contribution added weight, each corroboration tightened the net. Outside, city lights flickered across wet streets, reflecting in puddles like fractured constellations. Marcus looked up, feeling the quiet resolve solidify. Harlan had allies, power, and privilege, but patterns were objective, and patterns, once revealed, could not be undone. Marcus closed his notebook, aware that the coming days would be decisive. The work was meticulous, exhausting, but essential. The system, flawed though it was being held accountable, not by anger, not by rhetoric, but by methodical, undeniable evidence. Tonight, Marcus understood clearly. Patterns would speak louder than prejudice, louder than denial, louder than power unchecked. The courthouse was colder than Marcus Reed expected, even in mid-afternoon. He adjusted his tie, smoothed his jacket, and carried his notebook like a shield. Today wasn't about confrontation. It was about facts, patterns, and the slow, deliberate work of accountability. The hearing room was packed. DOJ officials, local government representatives, and media observers filled the benches. Marcus recognized familiar faces. Sergeant Porter, Officer Kim Alvarez, and a few colleagues from the compliance office. At the front sat Officer Daniel Harlan, visibly tense, papers stacked before him, a thin sheen of sweat on his brow. The proceedings began with a formal roll call and reading of the agenda. Harlan's attorney attempted a brief opening, framing the discussion as an overblown misinterpretation of a routine law enforcement encounter. Marcus listened, noting every carefully chosen word, every attempt to shift focus. When it was his turn to testify, Marcus took a deep breath and stepped forward. He felt the room's gaze press on him, the murmur of anticipation vibrating like a low hum. He opened his notebook, every page a record of meticulous observation and documentation. "Mr. Reed," the hearing officer began, "please describe the incident outside the 14th District Courthouse on January 13th. Marcus spoke clearly, voice steady. "At approximately 1845, I was standing on the public sidewalk, taking notes as part of my federal compliance duties. Officer Harlan approached and questioned my presence. He labeled me suspicious, knocked my notebook to the ground, and threatened detention despite my calm compliance. He recited the dialogue almost verbatim, pausing to emphasize the officer's tone and gestures. The room listened, rapt. When he mentioned Officer Alvarez's corroboration, heads nodded subtly. Harlan's attorney interrupted. "Objection. These are subjective interpretations of tone and intent." Marcus met the attorney's gaze evenly. "The body cam footage corroborates my account, showing physical contact, verbal escalation, and repeated attempts to intimidate." He gestured to the monitor, which replayed the key moments in precise sequence. The room went silent as the clips played. Harlan leaning in, the notebook hitting wet concrete, Marcus standing still, calm, his pen poised over the notebook. Even Harlan flinched. When questioned about prior incidents, Marcus presented his compiled map of complaints, patterns, and corroborating statements. Each thread reinforced a central theme. Harlan's behavior was not isolated but part of a larger, systemic pattern of bias and abuse. Harlan's face tightened. He opened his mouth several times, searching for a retort, but Marcus's evidence left little room for verbal manipulation. The officers seated nearby avoided his eyes, the tension of institutional loyalty colliding with undeniable facts. A DOJ official asked about emotional impact. Marcus paused, letting the weight of lived experience settle. "These incidents are not abstract," he said. "They carry emotional consequences for the individuals involved. Fear, humiliation, and the erosion of trust in law enforcement are all byproducts of unchecked bias." Questions continued. Harlan's attorney probed motives, technicalities, and procedural definitions. Marcus responded with clarity and consistency, always returning to evidence. The record, he said, speaks for itself. Policy exists to prevent arbitrary power. Compliance exists to enforce it. My role is to document objectively, not retaliate. Harlan shifted uncomfortably, muttering under his breath. The public witnesses scribbled notes. Journalists typed furiously. Every word Marcus spoke carried weight, shaping perception, influencing outcome. Porter and Alvarez provided testimony, reinforcing Marcus's observations. Alvarez's voice was calm but firm. I witnessed the escalation. Officer Harlan's labeling of Mr. Reed as suspicious was unprovoked and unnecessary. His tone and gestures were intimidating. Porter added, patterns of similar incidents have been documented. Compliance reviews exist to ensure that behavior aligns with policy. Today, evidence shows that these procedures were not followed. The hearing stretched on, but Marcus remained steady. When asked to summarize, he looked directly at Harlan. This isn't about one confrontation. It's about the culture that allows such confrontations to occur repeatedly. Accountability must be rooted in evidence, not convenience. A murmur passed through the room. Harlan's jaw clenched, eyes flicking to his attorney, then down at the table. For the first time, his confident posture wavered. As the hearing concluded, the officer in charge addressed the room. We will review all materials, witness statements, and footage before rendering a decision. No final judgment is immediate, but the record has been established. Marcus exhaled, a quiet release after hours of tension. The testimony was done, the evidence presented, and the patterns laid bare. The work was still far from complete, but the narrative was now anchored in documentation, corroboration, and clear observation. Outside, city traffic moved on. Marcus closed his notebook, feeling the subtle exhaustion settle in his shoulders. The room had witnessed truth, not dramatized or exaggerated, but carefully recorded, meticulously presented, and emotionally resonant. He walked past Harlan, whose face remained tight, a mixture of frustration and disbelief lingering. Marcus met his gaze briefly, eyes steady, no triumph, no malice, only the weight of accountability meeting unchecked power. The hearing had ended, but consequences were coming. Harlan's narrative had been challenged, exposed by documentation, testimony, and systemic patterns. Marcus understood that the path ahead would be measured, slow, and deliberate, but justice, however incremental, had begun to assert itself. That night, as Marcus walked home, the street lamps reflected on wet asphalt. The city moved, oblivious to the quiet reckoning that had taken place within its walls. Yet Marcus knew, systems, like people, could not ignore the truth forever. Patterns, once exposed, demanded change. The morning air was sharp with the scent of rain as Marcus Reed arrived at the compliance office. Word had spread quickly. Preliminary findings from the hearing were circulating internally. Harlan's professional reputation was fraying, his attempts to deflect accountability no longer shielding him. Marcus felt the weight of that knowledge, tempered by a quiet apprehension about what came next. Sergeant Porter met him in the lobby, eyes serious but measured. Marcus, the initial review panel has recommended disciplinary action, suspension pending investigation, mandatory retraining, and a full audit of officer conduct in the 14th District. Marcus absorbed the news, a flicker of vindication warming the tension in his chest. Yet he also recognized the emotional toll. Validation came with a cost. Public attention, colleagues scrutinizing him, and the lingering impact of reliving the courthouse incident in excruciating detail. Porter continued, "This is significant, but Harlan supporters are already mobilizing. Internal politics, whispers, and attempt to minimize the findings are inevitable. Stay vigilant. Documentation remains your strongest defense." Marcus nodded, flipping open his notebook. Each entry, each time-stamped observation, every witness statement now felt like both armor and burden. He understood that while consequences were finally beginning, systemic change required patience, vigilance, and endurance. By midday, he received emails from DOJ leadership acknowledging his role in the review. The tone was cautious, appreciative, and procedural. Your thorough documentation and professional demeanor have ensured the integrity of this review. Further actions will follow the established guidelines. A few blocks away, Harlan sat at his kitchen table, fingers tapping nervously against the laminate. The suspension letter sat in front of him, stark and final. Calls from colleagues went unanswered. Allies who had once circled the wagons now hesitated, unsure where loyalty should lie. His narrative of exaggeration and victimhood was crumbling under the weight of documented evidence. Back at the office, Marcus reviewed additional report from Alvarez and other officers who had chosen to speak anonymously. The tide was turning. Systemic patterns, previously minimized, were now receiving serious attention. Each corroboration reinforced the disciplinary process, making it increasingly difficult for Harlan to evade accountability. Yet Marcus was mindful that justice was not the same as satisfaction. The courthouse incident had left an emotional scar, one not easily healed by policy reforms or disciplinary letters. He wrote in his notebook, "Validation is not closure. Trauma lingers even when fairness prevails." A brief meeting with Porter and Alvarez provided a moment of collective reflection. "You've done your part," Alvarez said. "Now it's about institutional follow-through. The system is slow, but it's moving." Porter added, "And you've demonstrated what accountability looks like, not just for Harlan, but for the department as a whole." Marcus appreciated their support, but remained focused on the broader implications. Harlan's downfall, while deserved, was only one thread in the fabric of systemic reform. Policies will be adjusted, oversight strengthened, and community trust cautiously restored, but none of this erased the repeated harm inflicted on those previously labeled as suspicious. Late afternoon brought a public announcement from the DOJ detailing the recommended disciplinary measures. Media outlets highlighted Marcus's role, cautiously praising his professionalism and restraint. Social media amplified the message, connecting the courthouse incident to broader conversations about policing, racial bias, and oversight. Despite the public attention, Marcus felt a quiet fatigue. Walking home through drizzle-slick streets, he reflected on the cumulative impact. Each confrontation, each documentation session, each testimony had demanded emotional resilience. Change, even when achieved, carried a weight. At his apartment, Marcus opened his notebook one last time that evening. He reviewed the timeline of events, the courthouse incident, the body cam footage, Harlan's escalation, the internal review, and the patterns revealed. He noted the steps completed and the work still required for sustained reform. He closed the notebook, feeling the gravity of both success and ongoing responsibility. The immediate threat, Harlan's unchecked authority, was curtailed, but the city, the department, and the communities affected by systemic bias still required vigilance. Marcus understood that accountability was not a single act, but a continuum of observation, reporting, and persistent advocacy. As he looked out the window, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets glistening under lamplight. The city moved on, unaware of the subtle but profound changes taking root. Marcus allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. The scales had tipped, but equilibrium would require continued attention. Tonight, there was no celebration, only resolve. Marcus knew the system could bend toward accountability if met with evidence, persistence, and integrity. The work was far from complete, but a crucial shift had begun, and Harlan's power to inflict unchecked harm had been curtailed. The months that followed were quiet in some ways, and tumultuous in others. Marcus Reed walked the city streets with a different awareness now. Patterns of behavior that had once seemed invisible were clearer, more predictable. He carried the notebook less as armor and more as a tool, a map of accountability, of lessons learned, of the slow, meticulous work needed to enforce justice. The 14th District had begun to change. Harlan had been formally disciplined, his suspension finalized, and retraining mandated. Other officers with repeated complaints had been reassigned or counseled, and internal reviews had been strengthened. Systemic reforms were imperfect, uneven, and slow, but real. Marcus had observed the first tangible consequences of persistent oversight, yet the emotional residue remained. Every time Marcus thought back to the courthouse steps, the word suspicious echoed faintly, a reminder of the harm caused by assumptions and unchecked power. He had gained validation, yes, but also fatigue and a deeper understanding of the weight borne by those constantly under scrutiny. One morning, Alvarez stopped by his office. "The department is still tense," she said. "People are adjusting. Some officers resent the oversight, some welcome it, but the culture is shifting." Marcus nodded. "Change is incremental. But if nothing else, today's actions demonstrate that patterns can't be ignored indefinitely." Porter joined them, her expression reflective. "You've set a standard, Marcus, not just for this department, but for observers, oversight bodies, and the community. The message is clear: accountability matters, and persistence works." Marcus glanced at his notebook, open to the page where he had written, "Patterns demand accountability, not for revenge, but for justice." He smiled faintly, tracing the lines of ink. Justice was rarely simple or complete, but it was possible. Across the city, news reports followed the disciplinary proceedings and the resulting policy reforms. Community meetings were held, some tense, some hopeful. Citizens who had long felt powerless began sharing experiences and concerns, and the department listened, compelled by procedural compliance and the undeniable weight of documented patterns. Marcus took part in some of these sessions, quietly observing, taking notes. His role had shifted from direct confrontation with Harlan to fostering systemic reflection. The courthouse incident had been a spark. Now, it was a catalyst for broader change. But there were moments of quiet struggle. At night, when the city's hum settled into stillness, Marcus felt the residual tension, the memory of standing still while being labeled, judged, and threatened. He realized that even victory and accountability did not erase trauma. Emotional scars lingered, subtle and persistent. He wrote in his notebook one evening, "Resilience is not immunity. Awareness, persistence, and evidence our shields. Trauma remains, but so does the power of truth." Alvarez, who had become a trusted ally, remarked one day, "It's remarkable how far this has gone, and yet we're only scratching the surface." Marcus agreed. Systemic issues don't end with one person, one department, or one city. But every documented incident, every pattern revealed, every corrective action taken, it all contributes to lasting change. The sunlight spilled across the city skyline as Marcus looked out from his office window. He could see the courthouse in the distance, its steps no longer a site of confrontation, but a reminder of what meticulous observation and integrity could accomplish. He closed his notebook, taking a moment to breathe. The path forward remained long and uncertain, but he felt a tempered hope. System could bend toward justice when met with evidence, persistence, and unwavering professionalism. Marcus walked out into the afternoon, blending with the rhythm of the city. Footsteps on wet pavement, distant sirens, conversations in cafes, all ordinary, yet tinged with significance. Each moment a reminder of the work that remained, of vigilance required, of patterns that must never be ignored. The lights of the city glimmered, the night approaching, calm but watchful. Marcus understood that accountability was ongoing, that every observer, every participant, and every witness contributed to the balance of power. He carried the lessons forward, resolute and quiet, knowing that while individual battle could be won, the larger fight for fairness and justice would continue. And somewhere, in the shadows of the courthouse, the echoes of suspicious had lost their power, not erased, but rendered accountable, observed, and confronted. The system, imperfect and slow, had responded, and Marcus Reed had ensured that it could never ignore the truth again.